This article describes the background of the Russo-Georgian War, participants and their interests. Georgia. In the 9th century, the Principality of Abkhazia expanded over western Georgia and became the Kingdom of Abkhazia, whose capital was in Kutaisi. It soon replaced Greek with the Georgian language. Georgia was first created in the 10th century, defined as the lands in which church services and prayers were held in the Georgian language. The Abkhaz kingdom led the expansionist policy and soon enlarged its realm to the east. In 978, the Abkhaz kingdom and the Kingdom of Georgia unified through dynastic succession. The unification of Georgia was completed when the Emirate of Tbilisi was incorporated into Georgia and became its capital in 1122. However, after the Mongol invasions, Georgia eventually was broken up into several principalities. In 1801, the East Georgian Kingdom was annexed by the Russian Empire and became the Tiflis Governorate. The regions of western Georgia were incorporated into Kutaisi Governorate. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Georgia declared its independence on the 26th of May 1918. Although its independence was recognized by Russia in May 1920, the Russian Bolsheviks invaded independent Georgia in 1921. Georgia had 3 autonomous territories in Soviet times: Abkhazia, Agera, and South Ossetia. Only with Agera, populated by Muslim Georgians, was there a pronounced religious difference. However, Agerians and other Georgians share a common language and in fact many common elements of identity with the exception of religion. This seems to have been a factor in the prevention of the escalation of conflict between Tbilisi and Batumi. On the other hand, South Ossetians and the majority of Abkhaz are Orthodox Christians, whereas all the other determinants of ethnic identity separated them from the Georgians. Despite this fact, the conflicts between the Georgian central government and these territories were severe and violent. The first Soviet republic to leave the Soviet Union was Georgia. Relations with Russia have been fraught since Georgia proclaimed its independence in 1991. Georgia has always been skeptical toward the Commonwealth of independent states and of Russian intentions, and attracted to strategic partnership with the United States. South Ossetia. The Ossetians are an Indo-European ethnic group descended from the Alans, one of the Sarmatian tribes, and speaking the Ossetian language, which is an Iranian language similar to the Pathan language spoken in Afghanistan. The timing of the Ossetian arrival in the South Caucasus is debated. One recent theory holds that they settled there during the 13th and 14th centuries AD after being driven by Mongol invaders and Timur's armies. Historically, Ossetians and Georgians have lived together more or less peacefully and often intermarrying. When the Ossetians first came into contact with Tsarist Russia, geography and religion have since given the Ossetians a pro-Russian orientation. Ossetians joined both the Tsarist and Soviet army massively. They take pride in having produced more heroes of the Soviet Union per head of population than other Soviet peoples. The Soviet Georgian government, established after the Red Army invasion of Georgia in 1921, created the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast in April 1922 under pressure from KAV Bureau. Some historians believe that autonomy was granted to the Ossetians by the Bolsheviks in return for their assistance in fighting against independent Georgia. Since this territory had never been a separate entity, Ossetians moved in large numbers to Skin Valley, which used to have a larger population of Jews and Armenians than of Ossetians. North and South Ossetia were linked for the first time only in 1985 when the Rocky Tunnel was opened. South Ossetians and Georgians lived side by side for centuries without extensive friction. However, during the Soviet time, the region preferred to interact with the Soviet leadership leadership in Moscow and lacked personal ties to the Georgian leadership. Within South Ossetia, Georgian and Ossetian villages were mixed. Around 65,000 Ossetians lived in South Ossetia, while 100,000 lived in Georgia proper. Ossetians living in Georgia proper were fluent in the Georgian language and spoke it better than other minorities living in Georgia. South Ossetia had a Georgian ethnic minority of around 28,500 out of the total population of 98,500 in 1989. Abkhazia. The Abkhaz are an ethnic group related to the Circassian groups of the North Caucasus. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Abkhazia shifted between Bolshevik and Menshevik control before finally being conquered by the Bolshevik-controlled Red Army in 1921. In 1922, the Bolsheviks agreed to designate Abkhazia as a treaty republic within the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, granting the region considerable autonomy. However, in 1931, Abkhazia was downgraded to the status an autonomous republic within Georgia. After 1936, a severe policy of Georgianization, apparently at Joseph Stalin's whim, was enacted. Most political posts were given to Georgians, and mass immigration of non-Abkhaz peoples ensued, diluting the Abkhaz community to a meager 18% of Abkhazia's overall population by 1939. The inclusion of Abkhazia as an ASSR within Soviet Georgia in 1931 was seen as a legal act carried out by the Georgian Stalin by the Abkhaz. However, the Abkhaz SSR was not the only such entity that was downgraded to an autonomous position. The institution of an Abkhaz SSR would indeed have been an anomaly in Soviet nationality theory, mainly as SSR state it was only granted to substantially sized nations with a significant degree of national identity. However, from the perspective of Moscow at the time, the retaining of SSR status of Abkhazia would be prejudicial unless the same state thus were granted to the national minorities of the North Caucasus. Although the Kremlin might have wanted to weaken Georgia by such a step, it would have potentially grave consequences for Russia itself. Abkhazia's comparative wealth enabled the Abkhaz people to extract considerable concessions from the Soviet governance. Although the Soviets repeatedly refused to grant Abkhazia separation from Georgia, they did give the Abkhaz increased autonomy and economic credits to improve their infrastructure. During the 1970s, the Abkhaz gained increasing control of Abkhazia's administration, the control of ethnic Georgians likewise decreasing, and by the 1980s the Abkhaz filled 67% of the government's minister positions and 71% of the oblast committee department head positions. Considering that the Abkhaz minority within Abkhazia had by 1989 fallen to just 17.9%, this would indicate that the Abkhaz held a disproportionate share of the high-level administration. Growing prominence of the Abkhaz people angered Georgians living in Abkhazia who claimed they were being denied privileges. This rift precipitated the so-called ethnic battles of the 1970s and 80s which, although fought between different ethnic groups, were largely economic in nature. The Abkhaz viewed the Georgians as would-be defectors from the Soviet Union, whereas the Georgians criticized the Abkhaz for supporting the Soviet Union. The other ethnic groups living in Abkhazia tended to prefer maintaining the status quo, and thereby the Soviet Union, and thus tacitly supported the Abkhaz factions. Russia. Historically, the Caucasus has been an area over which empires have competed. It has served both as bridge and barrier to contacts between North and South, and between East and West. Its crucial geopolitical location, lying between the regional powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, is a mixed blessing. Russian interests in the region can be viewed as following. The South Caucasus forms a buffer zone between the North Caucasus and the Middle East to its south. The region is bordering Turkey and Iran. This is a region where Russia feels vulnerable. The South Caucasus is also a zone of important economic interests. If the South Caucasus is controlled by Russia, it enables Moscow to control the amount of Western influence in the geopolitically crucial Central Asia. Russia fought 2 wars in Chechnya to defend its frontier. According to Vladimir Putin, Russia has been playing a positive, stabilizing role in this part of the world, in the Caucasus as a whole. For centuries, it has been a guarantor of security, cooperation, and progress in this region. Georgia had 2 strategic characteristics that were seen as irreplaceable in Moscow: the border with Turkey and the location on the Black Sea. Russia is more worried of Turkish than Iranian influence in the Caucasus, and perceives Turkey as a threat in the political, economical and military fields. The Russian ruling elites had focused on Georgia since the days of the presidency of Eduard Shevardnadze, whom they blamed, together with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and Alexander Yakovlev, Central Committee Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, for the dissolution of the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence. Russian post-Soviet security establishments also viewed the Abkhaz coastline and illicit business opportunities provided by lawless Abkhazia and South Ossetia as additional incentives for deep involvement in Georgia. Of the 2 regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the first is strategically and economically more significant to Russia. In the 1990s, the Russian leadership noted that the strategic weight in the Black Sea depended on the presence of Russian troops on the Black Sea coast of the Caucasus. Russia hoped to use South Ossetia initially to keep Georgia within the Soviet Union and later in a Russian sphere of influence. For much of the 1990s, Russia was unable to restore its influence over Georgia. This changed when Vladimir Putin became the Russian president in 2000, and the recovery of Russian economy allowed Russia to begin rebuilding influence over its neighbors. Other actors, United States building close political ties with Georgia as opposed to the confrontation of the latter with Russia, gave the United States an opportunity to create a counterbalance to Russian dominance in the Caucasus. Georgia maintained a close relationship with the G.W. Bush administration of the United States of America. In 2002, the USA started the Georgia Train and Equip program to arm and train the Georgian military, and, in 2005, a Georgia Sustainment and Stability Operations program to broaden capabilities of the Georgian armed forces to sustain its contribution in the global war on terrorism. The United States Department of State described Georgia as an anchor for regional stability and prosperity, despite the fact that Freedom House had downgraded Georgia's democracy ranking after 2007. In 2008, Freedom House ranked the quality of Georgian democracy as lower than it was under President Eduard Shevardnadze. Energy routes. Although Georgia has no significant oil or gas reserves of its own, its territory hosts part of the important Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline transit route that supplies Europe. The pipeline transports 1 million barrels of oil per day. Russia, Iran and Persian Gulf countries were against the construction of the BTC pipeline. Operations of the pipeline started up first in Azerbaijan with the beginning of line fill at the head pump station at the Sangachal terminal on 10 May 2005. It has been a key factor for the United States' support for Georgia. allowing the West to reduce its reliance on Middle Eastern oil while bypassing Russia and Iran. U.S.-Israeli interests in Iran. Russian envoy to NATO Dmitry Rogozin claimed the United States could have plans to use Georgian airfields to launch airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. Rogozin said that Russian intelligence had obtained information indicating that Washington had plans to use the Georgian military infrastructure for a war on Iran, stating that the U.S. had already started active military preparations on Georgia's territory for such a strike, and that the reason why Washington values Saakashvili's regime so highly was that he gave permission to the U.S. to use its airfields. The Russian envoy's claims followed a UPI report that a secret agreement between Georgia and Israel had earmarked 2 military airfields in the south of Georgia for use by Israeli fighter bombers in a potential preemptive strike against Iran.